And we're going to graph this trig equation. First of all, let's remember what the basic cosine graph looks like. The basic cosine graph, if you remember, looks something like this. You've got a graph that goes, let's cut it into 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is 2 pi. This is pi over, this is pi over 2, and this is 3 pi over 2. Think of your unit circle, right, but stretched out on a coordinate plane. And let's say this is 1, and let's say this is -1. Then your normal cosine graph, your basic cosine graph, starts up here, ends up here. In the middle, it's at the bottom, and it goes through zeros at the pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. So your basic cosine graph is something like this. I kind of screwed that up. Let's try that again. That's your basic cosine graph, right? What do all these things do? What does a -1/2 do?
It's an amplitude, right?
It's an amplitude, and also the negative does what to it? It flips it. So it's going to flip upside down, and it's going to make it, instead of going up to 1, it's going to go up to 1/2 and down to 1/2, right? So that's what that will do, and it also flips it. So I'll just do like that. Okay? What does the +2 do to it?
Vertical shift, so like it start at the 2.
It shifts the entire center line. Instead of the center line being here, what's the center line? I'm going to make it a dotted line, and that dotted line is really what?
2.
Yeah, that dotted line is really y equals 2. So really my x-axis, and remember it was up 1/2 and down 1/2, so this is now 2.5, and this is now, subtract 1 from it, that's now 1.5. Does that make sense? So my x-axis is way down here now.
Okay.
Make sense? All right, and then here's the trickiest part, right here. This is the phase shift. So there's a couple ways you can do it. Here's what I like to do. I like to factor out this leading coefficient, and that gives me an equation that shows me two different things. My b, which helps me with my period. So b equals 2, which means 2 pi over the period. Sorry, let me redo that. The period equals, the period equals 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi over 2, which is just pi. So instead of going from 0 to 2 pi, again, I'm going to change some stuff. I'm just going to make some changes. That's not pi, 2 pi, that's pi. So this is pi over 2. So this is 3 pi over 4. I'm basically dividing everything by 2, and that's pi over 4. I'll explain more of that later, how you can do the intervals. All right, and the last thing is the phase shift. The phase shift is right here. And if it's a negative pi over 2, what does that mean?
Starts at.
It shifts which way, right or left, if it says minus pi over 2 in there.
Right.
You remember that? It shifts it right. So this goes right, pi over 2. So this point, again, I'm going to change this. I'm going to make that a dotted line now. That's actually, instead of being at 0, that's actually where? This is pi over 2. Which means I have to add pi over 2 to each one of these things. Okay? So you can do it that way. That's one way you can do it. Or the other way you can do it is you could have figured all that stuff out at the very beginning and then built your graph around what you know. So I'll show you how to do that instead. So here's how I would have done this problem now that you understand the understanding behind it. I would rewrite this, first of all, as -1/2 cosine of 2x minus pi over 2. I factored out a 2 plus 2. And I would literally just take all of those things I just told you, and I would do them one at a time. And actually, I would start by finding my period and my phase shift. So my period, like we talked about, is 2 pi over 2, which is pi. So let's draw our line here, and let's make our, you know that there's always going to be 5 different lines that you're writing. And this shift, the shift right here, this is where I start. I go right pi over 2. So this point is really pi over 2. Got it? That point's pi over 2. And the end point, remember this whole distance right here? That's called a what?
Cycle.
That's called 1 period or 1 cycle. The period equals what again?
Pi.
It equals pi. So I'm just going to add pi to pi over 2. What's pi plus pi over 2? 3 pi over 2. And now take pi, your period, and divide it by 4, and that shows you your interval lengths. Interval lengths are pi over 4. So literally add pi over 4 to this, and then add it again, and then add it again, and then add it again. So pi over 2 is the same as 2 pi over 4, right? So add 1, you get 3 pi over 4. Add 1 more, you get 4 pi over 4, which reduces that. Add 1 more, you get 5 pi over 4. Got it? That's how you make your intervals. Now that I've done that again usually is the hardest part. Now let's take care of so I already took care of all of the stuff, my horizontal stuff. Now I'm going to deal with the vertical stuff, and the vertical stuff is right here. I've got a shift of 2 up, and I've got flipped and an amplitude of only 1/2. So this point, again, I just take this and make this a dotted line. By the way, right now, since I'm already done with my horizontal stuff, I can go ahead and draw in my y-axis, right? It's going to be over here somewhere. You follow? And now, if I'm shifting it up too, what is this line really? This line is really y equals 2, right? And I'm going up to 2.5, and I'm going down to 1.5. You follow? And instead of starting at the top because it's negative, I'm going to start at the bottom. Let me clean this up a little bit here. I'm going to start down here. I'm going to end down there. In the middle, I'm going to be at the top right here. And points 2 and 4, I'm going to be in the middle. And so now I can just carefully draw my graph in there. And there's my graph. So that's how I would have done it. The time I did it before, I was kind of teaching it to you and explaining it. But now that you understand, hopefully, why it works, that's how I would have done that problem from start to finish. Start with the horizontal first, and then do the vertical. And that way you don't have to. Now again, you can just draw in your x-axis is going to be down there. So I actually wait to draw my axes in later, instead of having to like erase and draw, erase and draw, erase and draw. I draw my center line, make it a dotted line because I don't know where that's going to move up or down. And then I do my intervals, and I add, one of the keys there is to find that interval length, the period divided by 4, and then add it to your starting point. Add it to each one, add it to your starting point, and then just keep adding it until you get them, and then put the points in, and you're done.